Great. Well, thank you, John, for sitting down with us, participating in the MOOC. John Cawley, you are the Vice President of the J.W. McConnell Family Foundation, so thank you very much for spending some time with us. I ask everybody we sit down with on these deep dives what calls you to this space. So I wonder whether or not you could tell us a little bit about your background and why you find working in the social sector important.
Yeah, I didn't grow up wanting to work in philanthropy. I don't think anybody does. After university, traveled a lot, and I grew up at a time, I was lucky in the early 70s when one could graduate from university relatively debt-free and the job market is pretty flush. So taking off for a couple of years and coming back and working was actually a reasonable thing to expect to do. But of course, once one travels all over the world and sees things, it often really affects what you're going to do. And I ended up deciding, I went with CUSO for 3 years in West Africa and taught, and then I joined Canada World Youth, and I had an agricultural economics background, but I'd also been teaching a little bit, and this was an opportunity to actually work with young people in a non-formal setting. And my mother was always like, when are you going to get a real job? And I think it was only many years later when she realized, oh, actually that's what I'd like to do. And so working a lot in Africa and Asia on non-formal education projects, working a lot with young people in rural areas. Yes, it was a bit of a vagabond lifestyle, but it actually was serious work. And found myself, like a lot of people do. Yes, it was great working in the front lines with young people, with farmers, women's groups and things, but being able to then be in more of a planning position, and probably the most interesting job I ever had in some ways was training the field staff, because training trainers is actually really difficult. These are like experts in their fields, and you're training them to be more effective in what they do. And this was from people from 40 or 50 different countries and all the languages and everything else. Very intense. And along the way, I came across the, very active in the community sector on boards, and did consulting, organizational development along the way and things like that. I kind of went in and out of Canada World Youth a few times, and in 2000 came across the McConnell Foundation only because I did the McGill-McConnell program. So, which was a program for leaders in the community sector. And it was remarkable. And I guess that's how the McConnell Foundation heard of me and saw me, and a couple of us actually ended up working here. I several years later, when the timing was right, came in here as program staff, and now I'm the vice president.
So you've spent 15 years now with the foundation working in programming?
9 or 10.
9 or 10.
Yeah.
What evolution have you seen in terms of the social sector and the kinds of applications and the kind of granting that's happening? Like, just if you could describe the evolution a little bit.
Well, it's easy for me to describe the evolution of our approach than actually the approach of community organizations.
Sure.
Is that helpful?
That's very.
When I started here, we were still doing a lot of one-off individual grants. So, what I call the Vatican model is people throw the proposal under the door and they wait for the white or black smoke. And it's sort of the distant foundation that makes that decision. And we still do that, and those can be very good, but even before I got here, we were starting to do what we call foundation initiatives. So instead of one-off projects, looking at, in a domain, what would be impact that we'd like to have, and having basically a portfolio approach. So what cluster of grants that might be at a community level, it might be at a policy level, and it might be at sort of an infrastructure level. So an example of that would be if you want to improve conditions for Aboriginal people, maybe social workers need to be trained differently. That would be kind of that middle band. And we've done that and continue to do that. But even that approach, if you do it for 10 years, $10 or $15 million, it's still presumptuous that one foundation with a big program is really going to have the systems impact that we'd like. And I would say we're working more and more, although we still do the first two, they can be quite handy, is more of a platform approach. So as we're doing with both of these two programs, Recode and Cities for People, recognizing that there's multiple players, governments, private sector, other foundations, community sector. And what we realize that we do quite well is hold the space. We're seen, one of the advantages of being a foundation, we're seen as an honest broker. Like, we're not looking for money from anybody. We don't really have a political angle. I mean, everyone has a small p political angle, but we can, in a city or in a domain, invite people to come and talk, often unlikely allies or even not allies at all.
Right.
And they'll come because it's a safe space. So our ability to hold that space where people with different views can come together and at least explore working together. And so we're getting better at that notion. Okay, so how does our work combine with others? And I think the most important thing is granting is only a small part of what we do. Impact investing is more and more significant all the time. Our ability to work in a space without granting at all. But if we can pull in a federal and a provincial minister to come to a meeting on décrochage scolaire or something, well, that's our contribution. Sure. Yeah, and it's not that we've left the other two, because we have to be careful about romanticizing collective impact or these kind of approaches. They can actually be painful and inefficient at times as well, and finding the right approach and tool for the right challenge. In other words, if it's not a complex challenge, don't use approaches that work really well in complexity. Sometimes a good simple or a complicated approach is much better. So the portfolio approach can actually work better in some cases.
So since you've mentioned both of these platform initiatives, let's just hear a few words maybe about what is Recode and what is Cities for People.
Cities for People is named after the famous book by John Cawley of the same name. And I think what's interesting is I'd say there's two influences for us. One was social innovation generation, which was looking at how do we create spaces for innovation? What are the qualities, whether it be leadership or mentoring other people? And the second would have been internal, is that we were looking, quite frankly, to bolster our sustainability portfolio. We had a couple of big initiatives focused on the environment and sustainability broadly that we're finishing. What's the two interesting things, the sort of internal motivation was a recognition that even though many of our peers, meaning foundations, actually majority of the granting around sustainability is like species and wilderness preservation. There's if you want to save the polar bears, if you want to, and there's a huge amount of money to be raised focusing on that. For us, it's always about people and community, and my sort of shorthand for it is actually, if you want to save the polar bears, it's the behavior of people in downtown Toronto and Montreal and the systems that influence them as consumers and citizens, given the number of people who live in cities and our ecological footprint. That is what's going to save the planet. So an interest in cities, but I think what was interesting, we recognized a lot of people were already doing good things. There was no need to do a big RFP and discover the latest great thing. It actually was more a case of what are people already doing that can be accelerated or amplified by connecting them in different ways. So the philanthropic innovation was actually, in a sense, to create 4 sandboxes around different elements of the built in natural environment, civic engagement, art and social inclusion, and sharing economies. And basically engage 4 organizations and say, for 2 years, play in the sandbox. So it's really one big R&D phase. So the focus is actually on learning, not on performance. Clearly, we're not going to transform, say, Montreal's transportation system in 2 years. It's ridiculous. What we hope to do, though, is surface some promising approaches. What are rather than doing it on a whiteboard, which is a traditional, let's figure it all out on paper, a theory of change, and then engage people to do that. Actually, this is much more in keeping with prototyping. Let's identify 7, 8, 10 promising approaches, try them out, And actually what's happened is like 4 or 5 or 6 of the 49 that we've tried seem to be the ones like, wow, these are the ones that if one granted and invested and convened and connected over a decade really would be game changers. So we're coming up in the last 3 or 4 months of that experimental period. So we're really in a design phase, but it's quite a privilege and a luxury to have a 2-year R&D phase. Usually there's such pressure on community organizations or on foundations. You better have those short-term outputs that you can demonstrate or you lose your funding.
Right.
So it was quite fun, I think, for the curators as well of those 4 themes to say, I only have 2 conditions, that you experiment and play and that you share your learning. So you can make as many mistakes but I better learn about them. Recode is in many ways a continuation of this foundation's relationship with higher education institutions. I mean, going back, the foundation's been around 77, 78 years. And clearly, if anyone who's at McGill, the name McConnell is on lots of buildings, and he was a trustee for 37 years. So, but the granting then was, JW, we need an arena. So his name's on the arena. And then after that, it was more about scholarship for students. And in the early 90s was a shift away from sort of capital campaigns towards innovation in teaching. So there was a movement at that point and a robust granting phase in the mid-90s focused on innovation in teaching. And there was, I think, about 16 grants across the country. The challenge was, though, they were all in different fields. So it was apples and oranges. How do you decide which one is worth pursuing? The main we focused on was community service learning, which we did for 10 years, supported 10 universities, and now there's like 25 universities doing community service learning in Canada. We recognize, though, that community service learning in its form, the dominant form from the United States, there are limitations built into the sort of campus-driven model that you can only go so far. And even before the end of it, we're realizing, okay, so what would be a way to make universities even more engaged and relevant? And so our interest in social entrepreneurship as a way to be something, obviously if you're in social entrepreneurship, it's not just about learning in a classroom. It's actually, at the same time, we were bumping into a lot of students who actually had viable business ideas, but how can an undergraduate actually get support from a university or anyone? And recognizing there is a niche here that really authentic learning should be about trying and failing, and which is not always used in the same sentence as universities.
Sure.
And so having communities, industry, entrepreneurs involved in this as well, and this is just starting out, but we are supporting now, we were up to 22 colleges and universities who are getting quite different kinds of support to basically build their ecosystem around social entrepreneurship. And that could be the course level, that could be at the campus-wide buy into it, that could be about strengthening the student-led movements related to that, that could be bolstering their the industry community side of it. So there's lots of different parts of this, and it's just beginning, and it's quite exciting because I'm sure there will be, of the 22, there will be many successes, but what we're really hoping, and this would definitely be a value added to what didn't happen with CSL, can it be more than the sum of the parts? So can the learning, can the relationships, can the challenges, because we think there are social entrepreneurship opportunities that go way beyond one campus, where half a dozen universities and college might collaborate on something with a significant industry that has a national presence and says, I don't want to just do this in Montreal. We need students from across the country working on this and are willing to support it. And some of the challenges that one could imagine would be challenges that all kinds of campuses, like say the disability movement, creating devices for people with a disability. I know half a dozen universities who've got incredible programs in their engineering and related departments, creating devices and making a lot of money working with like insurance bureaus to get people with a disability back in the workforce, or iPhones, the ubiquitous iPhone, for somebody who's a quadriplegic, a device where you can actually control it when you have no function with your hands. There's actually a global market for that, because there's tens of thousands of people who have iPhones who are quadriplegics. So and that's something though that people can actually work on at a distance together. So the potential of this thing is remarkable. But of course, people have to get it right on their own campus. My own passion in this field, and this is stemming from my days at CSL, is just as this foundation needs to be asked, okay, you grant 3.5% to 4% every year of your endowment, so interest, a portion of your interest in grants. The question is, what are you doing with the other 96%, the capital? The same needs to be asked of universities. So if there are undergraduates and graduates who have viable business models, the endowments of the universities and colleges themselves could be used to support them. Now, I know the arguments, no, they're tied up. Our investment committee would never allow it, but our investment committee, which is meeting today, said the same thing. We can't do that. We have a fiduciary responsibility. They can change the rules. And if you can demonstrate that you can do well and do good at the same time, investment committees say, actually, this is viable. Anyway, these are both kind of in early stages, but they're quite exciting.
But you've touched on a number of different themes that are very, very much aligned with the 5 key topics of the MOOC. If I could drill further on the idea of learning and the importance of learning, one of our topics is impact assessment, and I know that you are a proponent of developmental evaluation. Could you describe what that is and the importance of learning as an organization that is trying to create impact, and how learning can improve the impact? Say a few words about that.
I think my biggest surprise when I came to the foundation was the extent to which I found community sector organizations had been socialized by funders, government and others, to play the accountability game. In other words, evaluation was just a way to keep the funding coming, and it was like to keep the funder on side but out of the way. And my first year here, I went to a GEO, which is Grantmakers Effectiveness Organization in the States, and it was a session on evaluation, and I thought I misheard when this academic doing a presentation said that 70% of the evaluations done for foundations in the States were not shared with the organization that the evaluation was about. I thought I heard 7 because, even that sounds like a lot. And then it actually was 70%. So what are they actually evaluating if they don't even share it with the organization whose work it's about? They clearly are evaluating their own granting.
Right.
Are we making effective grants that satisfy our board?
Right.
But in what way is that improving the performance of the organization that's doing the work?
Yeah.
So one of the things that my shock coming here was the number of organizations who assumed that this foundation, that the evaluation was for us. So we put a line item for evaluation in every grant, and that's actually for the organization to evaluate what they want to learn. But inevitably I'll get a call from some consultant saying, so I'm the evaluator, what do you want? And I say, why are you phoning me? You're working for this organization, and it's about Ted Chen, a friend of mine who used to be with the Kellogg Foundation and now is with a smaller foundation whose name escapes me, used to say, for them, their aha moment was, we have to get away from trying to retroactively prove whether something worked, and in real time, improve the performance of people, help them improve their performance. And developmental evaluation is very useful. It's focused on learning, not on performance, not on accountability and judgment that you didn't need this or this. It's particularly valuable in complex situations where you don't pretend that you have it all figured out on a whiteboard ahead of time. So even your theory of change is changing all the time. and it in a very timely way surfaces assumptions, surfaces the nature of relationships that are going on. Because so much in the early phases in particular, there are assumptions that one goes into. There are relationships that are just starting to gel, and inevitably there are misunderstandings. If you don't deal with those early on, 3 years later, you get a normative evaluation that says, well, this didn't work. Well, it's a little late. The horse has left the barn and the damage has been done. So it's very, very good at, in situations of complexity, at surfacing about relationships, about assumptions, and allows you to do rapid prototyping with course corrections. Now, I would say part of my job now, ironically, because people know that McConnell has been instrumental in training people across the country under Michael Quinn Patton and using it in our own work. Part of my job now is talking people out of using it.
Okay.
Because sometimes they want to use it inappropriately where it doesn't make sense. Just a straight evaluation on, we said we were going to do 1, 2, 3. Did you do it? And they're trying to bring in something that's much more focused on developmental evaluation when it's not really appropriate. It is very appropriate for complex situations, and I think particularly at the beginning, like even, I would say even the most interesting time is when we're in the R&D phase, before we even have a grant approved by our trustees, that messy process of who's in the ecosystem and needs to be involved, and we had a meeting of people and we left somebody out, and now we have to find a way to bring them in, or that first meeting with the private sector didn't go well. Why? If you don't surface that, you're going to make the same mistake again.
Sure.
And this may be even before you have an idea what the project is about, or what are we learning about negotiating contracts with consultants just to get this to the starting line. I think we realized a few years ago, we were doing these retroactive evaluations, which we still do, but saying the most powerful learning in these 10-year initiatives is often in the first year or two. And yet you're doing the evaluation halfway through and then again at the end. And do you really think after 3 or 4 years that when that learning is so vivid and powerful and visceral here, 2 or 3 years later, it's lost that, wow, I have to share that with my colleagues, and it's about passing that on to people who are dealing with similar situations in different domains that we find it quite useful.
So what advice would you give to people who are in the startup phase or in a sort of maybe 2-3 year out phase of a social initiative, a social enterprise, or some kind of community organization that believes in the importance of learning and developmental evaluation, using it appropriately, and the sort of inherent dance that exists with future resource, like attracting future resources, because there is that really strong relationship between the impact that you're having and the resources that you could then stimulate as a result, right? So there's this kind of correlation.
Right.
So what advice would you give about the importance of being honest about how you're going about evaluating your impact and learning from your processes, and at the same time still attract funding?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, if you're interested in innovation, you have to surface and embrace failure. We know in the private sector that, the key to success, my favorite example is WD-40. The stuff that you use to lubricate.
Yeah,
the WD-40 stands for Water Displacement 40. It was the 40th prototype of the same product. Unfortunately, in the social sector, that's much less prominent. I think because of the vulnerability and the fragility of funding. If you admit that you're making mistakes, you're worried about. The problem is, then people cover up and repeat dysfunctional behavior, structures, results, or they say, or a field gets fragmented. A case in point, a few years ago, United Way in Calgary, I believe it was, there were 5 or 6 organizations working in, trying to reduce homelessness, and they had, glowing reports, but some of the funders said, wait a minute, you keep telling us that they're doing good work, but we see that homelessness is going up. So if you narrow the field so much and say, the point is you can run a project with good outputs, but may not have at all the impact of actually changing the situation that you're trying to do. So how you define the issue, and are you really trying to change the game, or are you really just shuffling the deck chairs on the Titanic? Right? You're not actually making it better. You're trying to manage the problem. I mean, shelters would be a good example of that. And we have a relationship at the foundation with a couple of the big shelters where if their funding is based on how many beds are filled at night, think about it. Their incentive is to have as many beds filled every night, which means you don't actually want to reduce or eliminate homelessness. But the OBM, the Oldbury Mission, had the guts to step back and say, actually, if we're going to fulfill our mission, it would be about closing the shelter. Which they're not going to do overnight, but we have supported them in turning a floor that had, I don't know, 100 beds in it into one that had 18 small apartments to actually get those men with much more intense support back into housing, a job, et cetera, as opposed to just warehousing men for 20 years in some cases. They were good customers. They came back every night for 20 years, which is kind of you realize at a certain point you get up and you think, wait a minute, why are we doing this? So that's one thing, is the relationship between innovation and failure. It's also though about time frame. And this is where, I mean, I'm very sympathetic to community organizations who are scrambling to get grants that are a year or two, and you want to change the world? It's like, you're scratching the surface. So don't say that you're going to reduce poverty in such and such a neighborhood in 2 years. Even though the application says that you're supposed to, actually have manageable, modest things, but have a way of demonstrating that this is actually a precondition. Like, have a theory of change that may go out 10 years, but this is a precondition then to doing this and this. And so, because I find community organizers will often overstate. They're invited to overstate because funders are looking for the big impact, and then turn around and say you've got a year to do it.
Right.
I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. So I speak at quite a few. I remember speaking at a big conference on social innovation, and through the whole week, people had advice for all these social innovators. I was the keynote speaker on the last day, and at breakfast that morning, I decided to change entirely what it was about, and I started it with a slide, and it said, "Innovation for whom?" and basically said, we as funders need to look in the mirror. If we don't start innovating in the way we fund, it's easy to say, oh yeah, you guys have to innovate. Well, if we don't create conditions, long-term funding, encouraging failure, rewarding failure, providing capacity building, stuff like this, it's easy to ask the other person. I mean, change starts here.
Sure. So this loops back to something earlier that you were talking about with Cities for People. So 4 sandboxes, 49 projects, and there's maybe 6 or 7 that are bubbling up. I'm not sure from each or the entirety as really viable, scalable ideas. Talk a bit about scaling. You have lots of experience looking at grant applications. What have you come to realize makes for an organization where you can actually sense the scalability is going to work? And where do you know, what are the signs where you think it's not going to?
Right. Well, first of all, I think it's important to clarify what we mean by scaling, because there's lots of different definitions. The common one, of course, is people are doing something well, like say there's an organization here called Fit Spirit, which does incredible work with girls in schools around being physically active.
Okay.
And we supported them in a massive expansion of doing the same thing in more school boards and schools. But from the very beginning, I was warning Claudine Lavelle, who's a charismatic leader, that you're never going to have the impact you want just by scaling out like that. I mean, the system is just too big. Are you going to have an organization with 500 staff and a budget of this? It would implode. And many of our grantees, it's exciting, but also scary for them. They get to a point where they're actually very good at something, and the analogy I use, they get to the top of a mountain. They're the best at what they do of producing, and they can churn out a lot of product, and they realize we're not going to have the impact we want. We're in 50 schools, we'd have to be in 5,000. Doing more of the same is never going to get there. The exciting thing is, when you go hiking and you get to the top of the mountain, and then you say, oh my God, the mountain I really intended to get to is that one. And you have to go down into a valley to go up the next one. And it's an analogy for, it's not about doing more of the same. You actually have to almost deconstruct what you do and recognize, so in Fit Spirit, or the same applies to a couple of organizations I've been working with, you have to say, actually, being a provider of a service or a good or a product, we're actually going to get out of that. Other people can do that. We are going to move upstream and, let's say in this case, train teachers and inspire school boards and have it be a condition of being certified to work with girls of a certain age that you need to be trained in our methodology. So instead of pumping out hundreds of frontline young women who are working with the girls, it's like, actually, the skill set that we need is working with people who work in the ecosystem around that issue. And it's a real switch goes off, and we see that all the time, whether it's in health or education. People realize, okay, the example I used a few minutes ago is maybe your passion is improving the lives of Aboriginal children. Well, if you're doing that one family, one community at a time, you at a certain point you say, no, all the social workers in the country need to be trained differently. That's an example of scaling up. So policy, structure, a famous case from the United States, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation was very interested in palliative care. They tried everything, and then realized at a certain point nurses were the key. And the key to having them change their behavior was to be certified as a nurse in the United States. You need to take 1 or 2 courses in palliative care. And given their size, they negotiated that with every nursing college, university in the entire country. Okay? But they'd worked for years on much more, well, palliative care is the issue. Let's fund palliative care clinics or inside hospitals. But it wasn't changing the system that's behind that, because behind these issues there's a whole system keeping it in place. The third type of scaling, though, I think, which is crucial, is scaling deep, which is the fundamental way people see the issue. So I can give examples of where smoking cessation, there were programs everywhere in the country. It was against the law. In, when was it, the early 90s or something, I was at Université de Laval. And at the cafeteria, there were 4-foot by 4-foot signs with the symbol for no smoking, fine, that everyone was chain smoking in the place. Mm-hmm. So there were laws against it. There were campaigns everywhere. But the culture was still that everybody chain smoked in Quebec among students at that time. Can you imagine nowadays if a student lit up in a food cafeteria, just what the reaction from the other students would be?
Right.
They wouldn't, the fine and going to see an authority to get them in trouble. Students would deal with that themselves. I don't think somebody would even dare do it. Mm-hmm. Why? Because the cultural norms around the issue. I'm old enough to remember when at Christmas time, everybody got drunk and drove. Not got drunk, but drinking and driving was incredibly common. Even after the laws and the fines and impounding your car, people still did it. But gradually over time, it seeps into what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. So if somebody now at a party has been drinking, it's actually the people at the party. It's not there, even if there's no police for 100 miles around, it's culturally not acceptable. And you see, that's the part that's exciting, is when it actually is no longer an innovation, it's just the way people behave, it's the cultural and mainstream practice.
So how can we encourage deep scaling?
For example, respect for and embracing LGBT community and issues. We should never underestimate the power of media. Mm-hmm. Over the last 20 years, through film, through TV shows, at very proactively having positive images of gay couples or whatever, it has a huge impact and creates a different climate as to what's acceptable and what's unacceptable. Mm-hmm. I mean, so there's multiple things, and clearly the legal thing isn't unimportant. Believe it or not, I used to be, because I curl a lot, on the executive of a Royal Canadian Legion. These are conservative places where, it's a bit of a stereotype. Old guys go to smoke and drink. We had, in a town just outside of Montreal, people went there to chain smoke. And several of us were trying to change it unsuccessfully. However, when there was only one employee say, it's affecting my health and I'm going to take you to the labor board, changed overnight. So the threat of a lawsuit, so sometimes that scaling up and policy, legal, regulatory framework is very important. But over time, the cultural part is the younger people who were there didn't want smoking anyway. So from now on, it's these mutually reinforcing things of change practice at the community level, changing that social worker behavior, and the deeply rooted, this going back to the smoking thing, telling people that it was affecting their health had actually very little impact on people. When small children came home from school and said, Daddy, you're poisoning me with your smoking, it's like, that was a game changer. So, and when we look at environmental issues, influencing this age and how you want to influence older people and change it, it's a 20-year generational thing.
So are there common features that you see in grant applications that give you an impression that scaling, whether it's up, down, across, deep, that you see like the potential? Is it stated explicitly that they see, or that they make it very clear that they understand how they want to scale, or are you reading between the lines?
Right.
I'm just wondering if you...
yeah, I would say it depends on where they are kind of in their innovation journey.
Yeah.
Usually when we first encounter people, they've got a magic something and they just want to do more of it.
Right.
That's normal.
Yeah.
I've got something I'm incredible at and we've got a team and everybody's demanding it, we want to do more of it.
Right.
But what we're attracted to, there's something about them that it actually is about impact. They will not just be satisfied by doing more of it if it doesn't change the world the way they want to. And you realize they're going to get that to the top of that mountain and say, this is what I set out to do. And you know what? We're now in 100 communities, we used to be in 4. And I thought when I got here I'd be happy with it. I'm not. And they're the kind of people, if they want to change the world, they're willing to actually, in a sense, start over. It's not starting over, but it can be disruptive to an organization when the founder says, you know what, we're getting out of the business of X. What? We built the whole organization around that. We're going to go from building cars to designing them and teaching people how to drive them. I mean, that's perhaps a bad example, but the example I use of FitSpirit, we're no longer going to do all these community-based events for the girls. It's just, we can't hire 500 people. What if we change the way teachers view their role? What if they see wellness, the physical side of wellness, as an important part of being academic achievement and being a good citizen? You're starting to, and you say, you know, so it really changes. So no, I would say when we first meet people, they rarely see that whole, and neither do we, quite frankly. It's presumptuous to say that we see that trajectory either. The only advantage we have, I've probably seen it now 20 times in organizations who've gone from that sort of, wow, let's just do more of this, and we'll support that. The fun part is when they have that sort of existential angst, and it's like, I'm at the top of the heap. Right. And it's often a private, you know, I should be glowing, we're winning awards, and I'm not happy. Because I really don't think we're having the change that we should be having. And that's when you're ready. Well, and we have some gatherings. We have a thing called the Social Innovation Learning Program, which actually brings people together who are at a similar phase of their sort of innovation journey, where they're asking those difficult questions of themselves. And what's fun for them, they meet, wow, they're facing the same thing I am. Yeah. You know, they're dealing with youth with a disability and I'm dealing with a literacy program. And I thought you were a star and you've got the same insecurities that I have, that you actually want to change what you do. And there's people who can train and support us and mentor us, some of what we call the tall trees, the sort of icons of the social innovation movement who've been through that whole thing and build an organization only to break it down and start over again. There's more support out there than people realize.
So I have 2 last questions for you. Henry wrote a book called Rebalancing Society, and he believes, you know, these 3 big sectors, 2 of them are quite powerful. public sector and the private sector, but what he calls the plural sector, so where all this social initiative activity is taking place, is not as strong in the face of these other two sectors. They're not as well organized, and people are working in isolation oftentimes, not speaking with one another in a unified way. Maybe that will never change. But he asks the question, how could the plural sector become stronger in the face of these two other sectors? And you've talked about, you know, a variety of different developmental stages and all of these organizations that have different needs at different times. And we're creating a MOOC where we are really trying to speak to everybody who wants to contribute in some way to the improvement of society. So I don't know what kind of advice or thoughts you would have in terms of what the community who may be watching the MOOC could do potentially to find opportunities to collaborate, create capacity, and be stronger, based on any of your learning over the last 20 years of work.
Yeah, a couple of things. But my first comment would be, I think the community sector underestimates its power. Say working with, whether it's the private sector, government, or a big foundation like ours, they have expertise, community credibility, relationships, knowledge in the domain. We can't do our work without them. We're actually very dependent on them, and I don't think they realize that. They sometimes put too much weight on the value of the money. All it is some of the gas in the gas tank. It's not the engine that's driving it, so that would be my first comment. I think they underestimate the power that they have, and in the process of either applying or co-creating something, they actually, if they are doing something well, they actually can be more in the driver's seat than they think. My other comment would be, sometimes community organizations are too concerned about building and maintaining the organization. Is it the organization or the mission of the organization and the impact you hope to have? In this country, more than many countries that I've worked in, we have a lot of community sector organizations. And in the field that my background, a lot of it is in international development and youth organization. Anytime somebody has a little tiff or we're different than them, they split apart and create a new organization. Part of that's okay, but you spend an awful lot of energy feeding the machine to keep it going. Mm-hmm. And I have conversations quite often with some charismatic leaders who have organizations and say, you're spending a disproportionate amount of your time fighting with the landlord because the people are breaking into the building, and you're an internationally recognized, and you're spending time on la poutine of the organization. You could be the star director of a department in a larger organization, and we know that you actually worked for them but broke away, and they've actually caught up with, and at the time it made sense, and you were innovative and charismatic, but they've actually caught up to you. And so, I've been involved in the youth and international development. When they got hammered losing government funds and everybody was tearing their hair out and stuff, there actually were some very creative mergers and the assumption that every organization is made to last forever. Not to pick on United Ways, but there are in some big cities, some big honking established organizations that are long-time recipients of United Way funding, and they're very, very good at the PR. They have golf tournaments, they raise a lot of money, etc. And there's some young upstart organizations, probably with better connections, say with cultural communities or people of color, but have a very small infrastructure. And the relative value sometimes is talking and communicating about their work, and when you really dig deep, there's some really good, small, innovative organizations. And I think one of the great things about the internet and the possibility for co-creating and collaborating in a way that small organizations, their nimbleness and their ability to co-create online and have shared platforms and things, nowadays there's some diseconomies of scale of big organizations where small organizations can run circles around them.
So the idea of co-working spaces makes a lot of sense to you, so to allow the small organizations to share resources and cross-contaminate.
And not only that, there was a group of 6 organizations, all youth-driven in Toronto we worked with, and all they did, they looked at their back office, and they realized they were all doing printing costs in a certain way. And they went to Eva's Initiatives, a very famous community organization that's supporting vulnerable youth often living on the street. And they have a printing thing, and they collectively reduced their own costs and gave all their printing to a social enterprise. So not only was it a good economic move, but they managed to support a well-allied, from mission point of view, organization. And there's an awful lot of that type of stuff that could be done.
I want to leave you with an opportunity to say a last word in case I haven't touched on anything that you feel like you really want to share, but I have to ask you about your yellow square.
This is Moose Hide campaign. There was a man in northern BC, an Indigenous man, and his 2 daughters decided that they wanted to do something about disappearing Aboriginal women. And so they shot a moose, cut it up into little pieces. I think they may have had more than one because there's thousands of things now. And what it is, people who are wearing it are men, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal men. That's an expression of our solidarity with Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal women, their human rights, and recognizing. What I like about that is recognizing the role that men have to play in it. It's not a women's issue, but also calling on men from different cultural backgrounds that it's not an Indigenous issue. It's a man's issue, and it's all of our issue. It's a Canadian issue.
So are there any concluding thoughts? Anything that you thought maybe I would ask about, or a thought that you parked and you're like, oh, I hope we get back to that? I just want to give you room to add anything. I know that you had those scaling stories. I'm assuming those are the ones that came up, but maybe there were others. I don't know. I just want to give you the space while we have the camera here.
Not really.
No.
I'm expecting words of wisdom. You're probably not going to get it. You know me. If you ask a question, wind me up and I'll go. But,
yeah.
There isn't.
Are you optimistic about the future?
I'm not optimistic or pessimistic. There's reason to be both, but I'm hopeful. There's a difference. And part of that, I think we have to be hopeful, or you can't do the work. There's lots of, whether it's climate change or war in the Middle East, there's lots of reasons to be, we're screwing things up every time we look at it. But when I see where young people are at and their knowledge and commitment and potential for doing things differently, I think we're just at the very beginning. And it's not just about the internet. That's the sort of technical manifestation of different ways of seeing the world and working together. And anything that changes space and time has the potential to really revolutionize things. So how we organize our offices, and people can work from home, and people can co-locate and things like that. It actually changes power, how you do that. And what's exciting about it is it's not for trying to figure it out on a whiteboard. No. We're all new at this, so we experiment and learn from it. That's why it gets me up in the morning, is that I have a job where I'm learning new and exciting stuff every day. And not just stuff that other people are doing, like how do you do philanthropy? When I started here, in my interview to work here, I cheekily said, well, it's fun giving out 20 million a year, but it's actually the 500 million of the endowment, which would be much more fun. And I was told, no. The program staff, you're responsible for granting. The investment side, we look after the investment side. Well, now that's not the case. The investing and the granting are all together. The investments have to be aligned with and in support of the overall mission, which, when you think about it, whether you're working on cities or big change at universities, instead of, $20 million of granting at $300,000 or $400,000 at a time, say Aboriginal issues, you can only have so many early childhood education programs, which are great. But if people are crammed into substandard houses, we can actually invest into a robust, community-driven housing program. So physical infrastructure, which is quite exciting to have a whole new suite of tools available to us for social change.
It's been great to spend this time with you, John. Thank you so much.
Thank you.